Perfect. So we are live right now. Hello, everyone. I realized that this is not the time that we had scheduled for this broadcast, but it just worked out better to do a bit earlier. So we'll see who ends up coming on. We're going to give it just a few minutes. We'll just kind of chat and hopefully some people will tune in and watch. We're going to be chatting for a little bit. I have with me today Dr. Janet Diaz. She is a part-time professor at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. She's also heavily involved with work in one of the local churches in the area. So welcome, Dr. Diaz.
Thank you, Avery. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So whereabouts is the parish you're involved with, by the way? I'm just wondering.
It's in a suburb west of Detroit called Novi, Michigan. It's
okay.
Yeah, right due west of the city. It's a pretty highly populated suburb, very diverse. It's a very diverse place, and the parish where I work reflects the diversity of this area.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we can certainly circle back to that a little bit later, I think. But I think it's going to be interesting. Most of the people watching are probably going to be Canadians, so
okay,
it might be a little bit of a different, different feel. Also, just so you know, Dr. Diaz, just up in the corner beside the top left hand of your screen where it says live, there's also the little eye symbol will indicate if there's anyone watching. Just so you know.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So right no now one's it says watching right now.
No, it says 2 people. So, okay. But the number may go up and down. We're grateful for anyone that wants to listen to a little bit of our exchange here. So,
yes.
And maybe give it we're going to probably give another minute or two just in case anyone else stumbles across this before we kind of dive into the main content. But yeah, I for those of you who don't know, I was in Detroit last year, I guess this time, and had started my degree at Sacred Heart in Detroit. And but I didn't meet you, Dr. Diaz, until the fall, I think. We first class together back in September.
Fall.
Yeah. So I'm sure it's been an interesting experience for all of us, of course, with the school being closed down, I guess, from a week before Thanksgiving, in the US, and then it's finally reopening on Monday. I think that's
on the plan. Monday, the classes in person begin again, but with many precautions, of course. So,
right.
But it will be nice to be able to be in person with students.
Yeah, I can feel that. I think I'm in Ontario right now, and so some of the high schools and elementary schools are back.
Okay.
But I don't know about the universities. I think a lot of them elected to just go online for maybe even the whole semester, which of course is kind of problematic. But
right.
Again, it depends what you're studying, right? Some things are easier to do at home than others. All the chemistry majors.
When you're doing classes related to ministry, it is, I think, a big benefit if you can have at least some in-person interaction.
Yeah. And I mean, of course, that's really been the heart of this project, is that recognizing that, especially during this time when so many of us have been, can't go to our places of work or can't go to our institutions of education, that so many of us are online now. And so often we forget that, there are real people at the end of the screen, right? Where we become somewhat desensitized. Yeah. So that's kind of,
although I have to say that it's been my experience with all of the using technology, Zoom and other means, that you do really get more personal interaction than you might expect. I found that I've been able to get to know students, for example, a little more than I might have thought, or to be in meetings and really pick up more than you would think you might pick up being, on the screens. I think, it hasn't been as bad. I'm very grateful, really, for all these ways that we've been able to connect. And I think it's better than we might have expected.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that's been your experience. I think
Yeah,
it's been a bit of a mixed bag for some of us. I know that, I'm very fortunate because most of my classes are quite small, right? Less than 30 people. So that makes it a lot easier. But
sure.
I know that, people I know that have, lectures with over 100 people, it makes it, it's, you know,
Right.
it's, it's a little more challenging. But
Yes.
anyway, we're just about the 5 minute mark here, so I think we're going to probably start with our actual conversation. But I just want to say hello to anyone who is watching on Facebook or on YouTube, whether through the actual channels for this project or on my own personal Facebook profile. I just want to say hello to all of you. I have with me this evening Dr. Janet Diaz. Dr. Diaz, again, is a part-time faculty member at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Detroit. And she's also heavily involved with work in one of the churches not too far from Detroit on the west side there. So, Dr. Diaz, again, so great to have you.
Thanks,
And I
Andrew.
was just wondering, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of maybe an introduction to yourself, a little bit about your own experience and how you ended up where you are now. And one thing too, I mean, the point of this broadcast, we're really focusing on those issues of unity and diversity, especially in light of some of the racial tensions, particularly in the U.S. that have kind of sprung up recently, and just a lot of the division that's been happening. So, with an eye on those things, if you want to give us a little bit of your introduction as to who you are, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
So I grew up in Pennsylvania, in a not very diverse area of that state. But as I got older and went off to university and started to have other experiences, I personally felt very drawn to more multicultural settings. I really enjoyed studying languages. That was one of the things that I enjoyed most in university. And that led me into meeting people from different countries, people, who spoke different languages as their native language. And I started to realize that it was going to be important for me to be able to work in a climate that really included diversity. I was very curious about other cultures, curious about other languages. I was fortunate in the sense that I'm good at learning languages. I'm not at all good at math. So my brain is definitely one-sided, but I'm good at learning languages. So I launched into that quite a bit, and I ended up in graduate school teaching English as a second language to students that had come to the United States to do usually master's degrees, and they needed to learn English before they could go into their studies. So I really met people from all over the world, many different countries that were sending people to the United States to learn English and then pursue master's degrees with the idea that they would then go back to their countries to work, as prepared professionals in whatever their field was. At that time, I met my husband. He was actually my student as learning English. And he is from Venezuela. His name is Luis. And we started dating after the semester ended and got married. We moved to Venezuela for 5 years shortly after we got married. So I
Oh,
got to
wow.
really learn a lot about Venezuelan culture and got to learn Spanish very well. It was just an amazing experience. I was 25 at the time, much younger and much more adventurous, I think, which was a good time in my life to do that because I was able to really take a lot in. And ever since then, I've always tried to be in some different way in diversity. So fast forward many years, I started to work in ministry settings in churches. And because I speak Spanish and because I understand Hispanic culture pretty well, I started to work with a lot of Hispanics in churches. And I did that for several years. It was a great blessing to me to be able to work with the Hispanic community in churches, around Detroit. And I did that for quite a while. And talking about unity, I just wanted to say, because I know that that's something that Avery wants to talk about during our time together. This is a very big issue in churches, this whole idea of unity. As you know, it is in our society, of course, as well, but the churches are kind of a microcosm of that in some ways, because if you go to a church that's diverse in terms of cultures and languages, you know, it's sometimes difficult for people to really integrate. And you might think, oh, but it's a church, you know, they all get along and they all, you know, try to love one another. And yeah, sure, that's the idea. But it takes some work, you know, it really takes some work for people to kind of get used to one another's habits, to learn about one another, be open to learning about one another, and then eventually kind of develop a love for one another. So it's the churches are, and I'm sure, you know, mosques and synagogues might be similar in this way. I've never worked in those places, but any kind of religious gathering place, in certain places there is a lot of diversity in those settings, and so that's a great springboard for us to learn about diversity, to learn about how to achieve unity, and to kind of then take that out into our wider lives. So I feel very fortunate to have had that kind of experience. And now, after doing a lot of that and still working, I work now in a church that's quite diverse. And then I ended up getting a doctorate degree, and then started teaching students about, one of the classes that I teach anyway, is about how to work effectively in multicultural settings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that's actually the course where I met you this past semester,
Yes.
which I thought was a really really interesting. You know, just some of the things that came up. Also, hello again to all of the people that are watching, all our viewers. Just want to encourage you, if you have any questions or comments about anything that's being said, you want to ask Dr. Diaz something, or you want to ask me something, feel free to comment. We can see all the comments as they come up live, and we'll certainly respond to your questions. But yes, I can. It's quite the background. I've never heard all the story, but it must have been really incredible living in Venezuela.
At that time, it was in much better shape than it is now. Yes.
Yeah. I think too, one thing, I mean, I mentioned kind of before when you and I were just chatting, but and maybe at the start of this broadcast, but as a Canadian, I found it really interesting, just because, like, being in the US and especially the class with you, because we don't have a large Hispanic population, relatively speaking, right? Certainly compared to the US. And of course, and I mean, you would probably have the exact number, but to my understanding right now in the US, and especially with the Catholic Church, because a lot of Hispanic countries have traditionally been Catholic. There's been this huge shift that's occurred. And I think it's something like 30% of the Catholics in the US are of Hispanic origin. Is that correct?
It's actually getting closer to 45%.
Oh, wow.
Of Hispanics or of Catholics are of Hispanic origin. And what's interesting about that too, Avery, it's not just the number of Hispanics, but it's also their age. They are on average younger. So if you look at the ages, over 50% of Catholics 30 or younger are Hispanic in the United States.
Wow.
So yeah, they are a much younger population in our church than the overall population in the church. So this is a really important factor for us too.
Yeah, for sure. I guess and I raise that because, again, it's just a different kind of cultural environment than what we'd have here in Canada. Right?
Yes.
There's different backgrounds that you would experience. And I mean, of course, as in with the US, it also probably depends on where you are in the country, right? Certain city centers and certain states are going to have higher concentrations of different minorities, so
right.
I know, for example, that I imagine, Texas probably has a much higher Hispanic population than, say, Wisconsin, right?
Of course. Yes.
And we have similar dynamics here, right? So, for example, in Canada, Winnipeg, which is further west from where I am now, but has a very high number of Indigenous First Nations people. So pretty, diverse compared to where I grew up in Ottawa, which had a relatively low population. So, but Yeah, but I bring all this up because I mean the kind of the focus is unity, and I guess you know, you kind of mentioned it. You said, you know, like a church, you would think we'd all kind of get along, right? But you know, from my limited experience, and I'm sure certainly from your own experience that you can, you know, attest to the fact that's not always the case. So you know, what is it you think that like people, they see somebody who's you know, maybe speaks a different language, has a different cultural heritage, even they're from, you know, a different city where, you know, things are done a little bit differently, and all of a sudden there's these walls up. Why do you think that is?
I think there are different factors for it. I think one big factor is fear. Frankly, you
Mm.
know, I think it makes us afraid when, you know, we're used to being in our own cultural setting with our own language, with our own kind of norms, and all of a sudden we're confronted with having to kind of coexist with people who are different from us. And I think it can be a little bit scary for people. I think that fear, once we can get past it, we see the beautiful opportunities that are there. But I think initially it's kind of a drawing back of, you know, this is different and I don't feel comfortable with it. You know, it gets me out of my comfort zone. I don't want to go there.
Mhm.
So I think that's part of it. Another reason that I've seen, and I've seen this in churches, but I know it happens also in neighborhoods and in cities, different parts of cities. Um, People feel an ownership, you know, of their neighborhood or an ownership of their church or an
Mhm.
ownership of their little corner of the world, whatever it might be. And when somebody different comes on the scene, I think there's a sense of being kind of threatened and of saying, wait a minute, this isn't
Mhm.
this isn't my neighborhood, this isn't my church, you know, this isn't how we do things here. And
Right.
so instead of welcoming, you know, and seeing this as really an opportunity, a gift, a way to grow, many people feel, you know, threatened by the difference. And it takes conscious work and effort to get past those kinds of reactions, I think. Um, but I think as human beings, you know, sometimes we do tend to kind of have those reactions. I think a lot of that is behind some of the racial, you know, behaviors or responding to other races that we sometimes run into as well. You know, that people are different, so I automatically dislike that. I
Mhm.
automatically don't want to be in that circle that's different from how I am.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's some great insights. Certainly, you know, the fear, the sense of ownership. We want to
yeah,
be in control, right? And we're afraid of
right,
that which we can't control. So,
yes.
and I think certainly, um, you know, it's it is what it is. I mean, unfortunate to some extent, but as Canadians, sometimes we're more concerned about what's going on in the U.S. than we are about what's going on in our own country. And certainly for anyone who's been even remotely attentive to what's, you know, the past 6 months to, you know, 10 months, the US, I mean, from my perception at least, and I think the perception of many people, has certainly been experiencing this on a national level, this sort of disunity, this division.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily along any kind of racial lines. It's not like a particular ethnic group is, you know, fighting against a different ethnic group, thank God.
Yeah.
But it's from what I can tell, it's more on, you know, an ideological level, political views. And so, you know, that same kind of, but it's the same phenomenon. It's the same experience, right? Of kind of
Yes.
this us them mentality,
Right.
right? Um,
Yes.
and I think in some ways those differences are even harder, right? And you know, in the videos that he posted earlier this week, kind of talked about that. Like, there's this sense in which, you know, if it's just a difference of skin color, you know, or just a difference of you're from this country, this heritage, I'm from this country, you know, this heritage, those can be a little bit easier to work with, right? If people are willing to be honest, but it can sometimes be more challenging when people express views that are radically different from our own, right? Be that
Yes.
politics or religion.
Right.
There's something about that, you know, fundamental that really kind of irks us, you know? Um,
Yes.
so I guess the question for you is, um, looking at the church and periods in the church's history where there was this kind of, maybe in some places, the sense of you need to conform to fit in, right? And this is what we believe, and if you don't believe this, then you're out. That kind of mentality, or if you're not out, then you're outcast, within the community.
Right.
I guess in light of that, what contributions do you think the church and Christianity in general, and even more broadly religion in general, what do you think the contribution could be to restoring unity in the US, but in other environments that are experiencing that kind of division?
Yeah, I think the most basic thing that we need to bring back into our consciousness, that we need to remember in that respect, Avery, is that every single person, we believe in Christianity, we believe that God makes every single person in his image and likeness. So think about that. That's an incredible thing, really. If you believe in God and you believe that God is all that we say about him, he's the creator of everything, and he's all powerful, and he's all knowing, and all the things that we believe about God, to say that I and every other person is made in the image and likeness of God is really an awesome fact, to know about people. So if you really spend time thinking about that, and you really kind of take that in and try to make it, a part of who you are, like a way you respond to other people, you automatically, your heart is going to be more open to wanting to be unified with that other person. And yes, there are so many divisions going on, especially in the US right now, so many disagreements, so many ideological camps, so many, as you said, us and them, and, about all different issues, I mean, you name it, it seems like there's an ideological camp for it. And we need to get back to viewing one another as brothers and sisters who are made in the image and likeness of God. If we could just try to, step back, like when someone espouses a point of view that I completely disagree with, maybe instead of just reacting right off the bat and saying, you're wrong, you're crazy, you don't know what you're talking about, whatever the knee-jerk reaction might be, to just step back and say, okay, this person that I'm interacting with right now, this person I'm responding to, is made just like me in the image and likeness of God. This is another precious human being that God made. And I think if you get that into your, get that really more ingrained, it's going to be hard for you to not have more patience, not have better listening skills, not want to pray for that person. All of those things are going to come easier to you.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point, is to remember who each person is. I think another thing that happens, and, Jesus points this out in the Gospels, in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, remove the log from your own eye before you try to remove the speck, the little splinter from your brother's eye.
Sure.
So often we have this tendency to want to criticize others, and oftentimes we're the ones, that aren't seeing, we're the ones that aren't listening, we're the ones that aren't hearing. And it's important to look at yourself first. You got to look at yourself first, and you got to get yourself kind of cleaned out before you're going to say whatever you wanted to say. And if you do that, you're probably not going to say something nearly as offensive to the other person.
Right.
That's my experience anyway.
Yeah, no, some great points there. I guess just on the first thing you said, I think, it's interesting, and it's unfortunate, because it's definitely something that the church holds to very strongly, this idea of the equality of all persons, right? And it goes right back to the Bible, different points. And we won't necessarily maybe get into all the theology of that, but unfortunately that principle wasn't always lived very well in the history of the church. And I mean, over 2,000 years of history spanning, hundreds of different countries, there's going to be some mistakes along the way.
Sure.
It doesn't make it right, but it's just the reality of what it is. But what I think is interesting is that, there is this sense in which when you take God out of the equation, you are much more likely to fall into this viewing of others based upon some changeable characteristic, right? This person is more intelligent. They're a more contributing member of society. They have the right skin color, the right eye color. They have the right ideology, fill in the blank. I think that's, what can happen, right? And of course, in the pre-Christian cultures and a lot of the cultures outside of Christianity, there was definitely, throughout history, there was definitely this view of the human person, right? Like, Aristotle, as much as the church, likes him and has taken some good things from him, he didn't believe everyone was equal,
Yeah.
Right? He thought, they're slaves and they're not as good and they're smart people. Plato thought that the society should just be ruled by all the smart people,
Yeah, exactly.
You're intelligent, you're fit to rule,
Yes, yes.
So I think it's, there is a connection there between, the biblical God and the equality of people. And when one is lost, I do think there might be this sense in which we start to lose sight of the other too.
Exactly. Yes.
So,
and when we lose sight of that, it makes it easy for us to do things that disunify. It makes it much easier for us to say the things we shouldn't say, to protest in ways we shouldn't protest, because we're losing that standard, within ourselves, that standard that really God would hold us to.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess this kind of ties into your second point, is that, and I completely agree with you, I think that a huge issue is that we're so unwilling often to look at ourselves.
Yeah.
And, we want to cast blame. And of course, I'm not going to pretend for a second that people in the church don't fall prey to this just as anybody else, like,
oh yeah,
which is, which is why, every mass begins with, yep, I messed up. I need mercy too. But, like there's this sense in which when we come into God's presence, we recognize the fact that we he's all holy and he's all good. And we're not so good, some of the time, or a lot of the time, perhaps. But all to say, when there's an inability to recognize our own mistakes, our own weakness, there does seem to be a corresponding, propensity to kind of pick on others and be critical of others and, not show mercy. Right. And I mean, Jesus says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Right. And it definitely seems that's, lacking a bit in our culture right now, is that willingness to be, merciful and charitable to one another.
Yes, exactly. No, I think it's really true that we need to spend more time to stop and look at ourselves. Oftentimes, this was something that a very wise person said once, and I think it's true, that if you really stop and think about it, oftentimes what we most criticize in other people end up being our greatest faults. And, I've had that happen to me more than once, where, I've eventually realized that, that I was criticizing something in someone else, maybe repeatedly. And then I when I kind of took that to prayer and asked God to help me with it, I realized, look at yourself, look at me, look how I tend to do that same thing. So, I think that's a very personal, that's on the pretty personal level, not societal level, but. Right.
But there is this sense in which that same dynamic also does apply to groups, right? I know that,
yes.
It's part of, something we talked about in our class together was, in order, and maybe you can speak to this in your own experience, but in order for a Christian, for example, a church community to become, integrated and to welcome in members of different cultural backgrounds, part of that is an acknowledgement of kind of their own shortcomings and maybe the ways that they've closed the door to others in the past, right? And until you have that acknowledgement, it makes it really hard to move forward. So can you maybe speak to that a little bit on the group level? So, I mean, again, it applies to the individual, but there's also a group dynamic in which that applies as well. So I'd be curious to hear what you have to say for that.
Yeah, and I think, well, for example, in churches, when there is, you know, a lack of unity and there's a need to really open the dominant group up to the newer group, and that's usually the way it is. There's usually what I would call a dominant group, which they're dominant either because they're the bigger number of people or because they've been around for a lot longer. And the dominant group is usually not open to the newcomers. So there is a need to, you know, really decide for the dominant people, whoever they are, to really decide that they are going to seek to integrate their community. And
Mhm.
every time I've seen that happen, the results are absolutely fabulous. You know, when people of different cultures and backgrounds do come together in a setting, it is a strengthening thing. You know, it really strengthens
Mhm.
everybody when you're able to achieve that unity, when you're able to achieve that integration. Um, but it can be very difficult. And there are people, oftentimes in those situations, what I've seen is that there are people, we sometimes call them bridge builders, who are kind of the leaders. They're the first ones out of the within the dominant community. They're the first ones who kind of raise their hands and say, okay, I'm going to cross the line. You know, I want unity
Mm,
with these other groups, and so
sure.
I'm going to lead in that. And even if they're not consciously thinking of leading the other people, they end up doing that because the other members of the dominant group see the experience they're having and they tend to follow. So it's
Mhm.
important, I think, to be kind of bold in that sense. You know, if you have any kind of heart at all for unity, step out in it. You know, step out in what you need to
Mhm.
do, because others will likely follow. You know, in that seeking unity, seeking integration.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. It does, you know, as much as it's the group that needs to have this change of heart, you know, this moment of turning, you know, towards the other. It does start with individuals, right? And that's usually how
Yes.
most change begins, you know, with one or two people actually being willing to do that.
Right.
Um, yeah, I guess just changing gears here a little bit, although still very much in line with what we're talking about. Um, you know, there's some people who are watching, um, who are willing to, but maybe they're willing to live peaceably with the other people, but they still want to preserve the sense of, you know, us and them. And I think, you know, especially of politics. So, you know,
Yeah.
myself, I would maybe identify, certainly in Canada, by Canada standards, I'd be a little bit more right of center, for example. And I've seen in some of the more conservative circles, just as I've seen in some of the more you know, liberal circles, that there can be, again, on both sides, there can be this rhetoric of, you know, this other side, there's nothing good here. We don't want anything to do with them. They ruin everything. And again, I as you know, someone who's more conservative, I've seen this from other conservatives, and it's unfortunate because I understand there's maybe a frustration with how this other group is acting, but I think what that does is it puts up a wall that I'm no longer able to recognize and accept the goodness of the other, both the goodness of the other person, but also what they can contribute. So I just wanted to use that as a segue. If you could maybe share a bit of your experience. You mentioned living in Venezuela, and you mentioned that you're, you know, pretty involved with the Hispanic community here there in Detroit, and you know, trying to bring about cultural integration. What are some, in your own experience, what has been some of the cultural riches that you've been able to experience from Hispanic culture in general?
Well, one of the biggest riches that I've really appreciated is the real emphasis on family in the Hispanic culture. I think in Anglo culture, you know, kind of the dominant Euro American culture of the United States, and I would guess in Canada it might be pretty similar. The family, the nuclear family, is kind of suffering, I would say, in some ways. You know, there are a lot of societal changes, currents that are kind of tending to weaken families and not have them be as unified as families or as committed to family. And in the Hispanic culture, the commitment to family and to seeing oneself not as an individual so much, but as a member of that group, that family, is so strong in Hispanic culture, and
Mm.
it really flies in the face of this rampant individualism that we, in U.S. culture is so strong. It's, I am an independent person. I am an individual. I think for myself. I make my own decisions. My reality is my reality. It goes on, that kind of mindset. Whereas in Hispanic culture, I think that's growing, but it's not as strong, and there's still much more of a tendency to see oneself not as an individual, but as part of that family unit. And so that's something that we can learn a lot from, in my experience, because the respect that it implies for other people and
Mm.
the dependence on other people that it brings with it are really, are good things. And, I think now of COVID and the pandemic, and so many people that are so isolated, that are so alone, um, you know, just, I mean, because of the restrictions, because of, the working from home, um, elderly people that, have to be especially careful. And so they're alone a lot of the time. Um, you know, this kind of thing, I mean, in Hispanic culture, that's just much less likely to happen because people were closer together and more close knit to begin with. And I think all that we're dealing with now with depression, anxiety, isolation, I think that's one of the scariest things personally about this time. Um, in our church, we're having a lot of funerals, a lot more funerals than normal. And they're not COVID deaths. I mean, a few are, but most of them are older people who, I just wonder how much isolation they were feeling. People who weren't necessarily sick before, and so I just feel that the Hispanic emphasis on family and the value that's placed on family life, for me, that's been something that I've really appreciated about Hispanic culture. Also, the whole idea of celebration, and
Mm.
fiesta. And, if you go to a mass in Spanish, we have a weekly mass in Spanish at my parish, every Saturday night at 6:30, in case anybody wants to cross the border. You can't cross the border very easily right now, but when that changes, if you want to come to Holy Family in Novi, 6:30 Saturday night Spanish Mass, and people, um, clap when they're singing and kind of dance, and there are a lot of little kids running around. A lot of the older, whites don't always appreciate the little kids running around, but there's this kind of more of a sense of celebration, a sense of outwardly expressing joy more than other cultures, tend to do. So that's another, I think, beautiful aspect that I've appreciated so much about Hispanic culture.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And
Yeah.
again, I'm sure so much of your experience in Venezuela was probably just like a whole different world, compared to growing
Yes.
up in Pennsylvania. And
Yeah, exactly. It was interesting when we got to Venezuela. I had met my husband's family. We went once before we got married. We went to Venezuela so that I could meet, I had met his parents and his sibling, but I hadn't met the aunts and uncles and cousins. And family is so important, even the extended family is very important. So we went there and I met all of them. And then we got married in Pennsylvania. And then when we moved to Caracas to live, um, the women in the family just surrounded me, in terms of, okay, let me take you to the grocery store. Let me take you to where you're going to get your hair cut. Let me take you to, all of these different places, and let me show you around. There was an incredible sense, which is another beautiful thing about Hispanic culture, of welcoming and, wanting to care for the other, very, in very, outward expressive ways.
yeah, that's so wonderful. Yeah, and I like that. I like that you mentioned family. I think,
Yeah,
and individualism. I think the more that our families are starting to struggle and become disintegrated, that that
yeah,
has cultural effects too. But from the sounds of it, your experience with Hispanic culture has been really positive,
it
and
has.
and of course, if you had just said from the outset, I don't want anything to do with this. I don't want to learn another language. I don't want to get involved in another culture. This is too much. This is too weird. This is not what I'm used to.
Yeah,
That you would have never experienced. I mean, you would be married. You'd have never,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
Yes,
experienced the riches.
exactly. Yeah,
So,
yeah. 39 years I've been married, so it's been a good thing.
wow, congratulations.
Yeah,
Congratulations. Yeah.
thank you.
Um, that's wonderful. And I mean, I think the parallel, of course, everything we've been talking about is, not everyone's going to necessarily find, a spouse from a different culture and all that. And
Sure.
that's fine. But the idea of being open, to what other people can offer us, it's something we lose when we're fighting with other people, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly. And it does make you more aware of prejudice and of stereotypes and of racism. I have to say, being married to a person who's, darker skinned and who looks different and sounds different, it makes you more, even though I'm in the majority in the United States in terms of how I look and how I speak and everything, being married to someone who's from a different country and a different, background, ethnic background, really makes you aware of their experience and some of the negative things that they experience because of, like you said, Avery, the walls that people tend to put up. I have a story about that, a little story that I could tell about my husband. We When we moved to Detroit, we bought a house, and it was in a new area where the houses were still being built. And so when we were the first house on our street that was finished, and so there were a lot of houses being built around us. And one day that they had finished the house across the street from us, and the people were moving in to the house. And my husband, Luis, was out in the front yard trimming shrubs and just cleaning up the yard and doing yard work. And the people, the husband from the family that was moving in across the street came over to Luis, to my husband, and said, I'd really like you to come over. I'm moving into this house over there. Could you please come over and give me a price for some landscaping work that I'd like to have done? And my husband, who's highly educated, and not that there's anything wrong with being a landscaper. Of course, I've worked with many, many Hispanic landscapers during my ministry, and they're wonderful people. But he assumed, he never thought that my husband was the homeowner. He
Mm-hmm.
assumed that he was hired
Right.
help.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Wow.
being married to somebody from a different culture gives you a different perspective in that sense.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, a little bit of a different dynamic, but I mean, my grandfather is from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, and so my father, is black or half black, and so he shared some stories of experiencing, some of the division from that, and so it's interesting to yeah, it's interesting when it's real people that you're connected to that are living through this, and whether, I mean, to varying degrees, right? I mean,
Right.
obviously there's been periods in the history of most countries, certainly in the US, there's the idea of slavery and severe persecution of different ethnic groups, uh,
Right.
I mean, even now it still affects us to some extent, and as I mentioned before, it's not necessarily just racial differences that are dividing us right now. In fact, I would argue those are probably a much lesser factor than maybe other things like political alignment or the basis
Yeah.
of faith. But
Yes.
I just want to kind of transition again. Again, I just want to say hello to anyone watching the broadcast here. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for liking this. And if you have any questions, again, for Dr. Diaz or for myself, please feel free to post a comment or share your thoughts with us on what you think. So I guess, again, changing gears here, the title of this video and of this kind of this week that we've been doing, really this idea of uniting the brokenhearted. So not just a surface level unity, but something that is healing and transformative. And I think we kind of mentioned before how, some of this division we could probably trace back to is an inability to self-reflect, an inability to honestly look at ourselves. And I think why, this idea of kind of the woundedness of our culture, I think, and this inability to be reflective, I think they kind of go hand in hand. And I think the experience of a lot of us, and I've been here, different times in my life, is that there's such a inner sense of hopelessness, woundedness, brokenness, that you don't want to let people into that. And there's also this real sense in which we all want, something. We want some kind of identity. And we hold on to something that gives us that identity, whether it is a certain, sport group or a political group or, whatever it may be. We want to hold on to something, right? And then when something challenges that, no, you're not part of this. I'm part of this. This is me. This is who I am. And if you attack that, then you're attacking me, And so I guess what I want to ask you, and maybe to share, obviously you're a theology professor, you're working full time in the church. What is the Christian perspective on that? On this kind of deep disunity within ourselves and this brokenness that so many of us experience. And what role does the gospel have in that? And how does God figure into that?
What you described, Avery, the state of so many people of being wounded and broken inside, and oftentimes needing to cling to some idea or group to kind of raise themselves up in some way or give themselves some kind of meaning in their lives. I think a lot of what that boils down to in many, many people is that whether they know it or not, inside of themselves, they do not believe that they are lovable. They don't believe that they're lovable. It can be because of, something that happened or things that happened in childhood. It can be because of mistakes they've made that they've never forgiven themselves for. It can be because of, struggling with mental illness, maybe. I mean, there are many different reasons. And I think, all of us are susceptible to this. And what it really, the foundation of it is not believing that we are lovable. Why would someone love me? I don't show it. I don't wear it on my sleeve. But really, when I look inside, I see this brokenness. I see these problems. I see these things that I don't want anybody to see. And, that's where the gospel and what we believe as Christians is so life-changing and so important for people who will really listen to it, which is the message of the gospel is that you have a Father who loves you. And it doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, you've made mistakes, you've done bad stuff, you've you're ashamed, you have insecurity, you suffer from anxiety, you commit the same sin day after day, maybe, you're addicted to pornography, you're whatever it might be, whatever you might be confronting, you have a Father who loves you. He loves you, and he's going to love you no matter what. And we need to learn, we need to open our eyes and let him love us, because that's what he wants more than anything, is to love us. And that's really the foundation of a strong and healthy life. That's really the foundation of being able to seek this kind of unity that you're talking about, Avery. I need to know that I am a daughter of my Heavenly Father, who has always loved me and will always love me. You need to know, Avery, that you are a son of your Heavenly Father who has always loved you and will always love you. And it's only in that knowledge that we can get ourselves, unbound, that we can untie all the knots that are inside ourselves about how we view ourselves and how we think we need to act, or how we think other people need to treat us. That's another big one. You know, if somebody doesn't treat me in the way I think I should be treated, I take it personally. You know, I let it bring me down. But no, what matters is God, and what God has done for you, and what God gives you, which is that unconditional love. Of course, God asks us to live good lives. God asks us to follow him. And the more we know how much he loves us, the more we want to follow him. It just, you know, it will happen naturally. But I think, yes, the woundedness is such a source of disunity. Because you know what? If I'm really wounded, I can't even connect properly with you. I can't even connect properly with one other person,
Right.
let alone whole groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that the gospel has a very, very strong message. And I would urge anybody who's feeling that way, who might be feeling broken, who might be feeling like nobody really could love me. You know, I have so many flaws, and you know, what am I worth? What worth do I have? You have great worth to your Father in heaven. Turn to him. Turn to him, however that might be best for you. Open the Bible. Go to a church and just, you know, seek fellowship there. Seek a community there. You know, if you're Catholic, receive the sacraments. You know, I mean, these are things that we can, you know, there are a lot of ways to enter into them, but I would just say that's the root of it. As I see it, Avery, that's the root of it. We need to know how much we are loved.
Wow.
And many people don't.
Yeah. Well, I think I would definitely agree with your assessment. So yeah, thank you for that. And it makes sense, right? I mean, you said before, if we're really wounded, it's really hard for us to love other people, especially other people who are wounded, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, of course, you know, in our Christian understanding of what love means, it's not this kind of selfish, clinging, emotional thing. I mean, our emotions are part of it, but it's, do I really want what's best for this other person, even when it costs me something, right? You know, even when it hurts me, even when it makes me uncomfortable, even when it's annoying or inconvenient, you know, do I really want what's best for that person?
Yes.
And I think the honest assessment for a lot of us is that when we look at our interactions with others, we fall short of that ideal, you know, in 1,001 ways, we fall short of that. And so, yeah.
You know, today is the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. I don't want to get too theological here, but today is the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a great, like one of the greatest, you know, I would say there are only a couple like him, theologians of the Catholic Church. And the way St. Thomas Aquinas defines love is willing the good of the other. Imagine that, willing the good of the other.
Yeah.
It's simple, but it's profound.
Yeah. So, you know, and it for me, it kind of reminds me, there's a verse in the first letter of John, and it says, you know, we love because he first loved us.
Yes.
You know, so kind of jumping back to what you were saying. So, again, an invitation to anyone who's watching to experience the love of the Father in Jesus Christ. And, you know, because it's a tall order, right? I mean, we're talking about unity. It's, you know, literally millions upon millions of people with different, you know, viewpoints from us and different backgrounds. And, you know, not everyone's going to treat us, you know, with respect or with dignity. Not everyone's going to like us. But somehow we got to make this all work. And for me, it's like, you know, either I can try to do that by myself with my own, you know, impediments and, you know, woundedness, or I can, you know, let God do the heavy lifting and, you know, let him love me and let him fix me up and let him give me the strength to love the people around me. So, anyway, I think, I think this is a great point for us to kind of conclude our conversation. I just really want to thank you, Dr. Diaz, for taking this time.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to say thank you to everyone who has watched either during the live stream or after the fact. You're watching the recording. Thanks for taking the time to check this out. Dr. Diaz mentioned, kind of reaching out and taking that first step, different ways you can do that. I also want to encourage you and remind you there's a separate email account that I've set up for this project. You can find it at uprojectoutreach@gmail.com. That's all one word, the letter U, and then projectoutreach@gmail.com. You can send any questions or comments you may have from this, this live chat or anything else that's come up throughout the week. And of course, if you have any questions for Dr. Diaz, I can always forward her that email so that she can get back to you. So
Sure.
just want to extend that offer to anyone that's there. Feel free to reach out. We're not, it's COVID and there's things going on, but we're not alone, right?
Absolutely not. We are not alone.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Dr. Diaz, so much for taking this time. And we're going to call it a night.
Avery.
Yeah. So we're going to say goodbye to everyone. I'm going to stop the broadcast.